All right, now I want you to go back to our Vidly project. So earlier in the course, you built this genres module. In this module, we used an array to keep all the genres in our application. Now that you know how to use MongoDB and Mongoose, I want you to get rid of this array and in all these route handlers like get, post, and the rest, work with our MongoDB database. So pause the video, do this exercise, and then come back, continue watching. All right, so the first thing we need to do is to install Mongoose. So npm install Mongoose. And you can see at the time of recording this video, I'm using Mongoose version 5. Now back in the code, we need to connect to MongoDB. But we don't want to make the connection here because that's something we need to do once at the application level. Remember this module, this genres.js module, this is purely responsible for our genres API. So in this application in the future, we're going to have more APIs for working with videos, for working with rentals, and so on. We don't want to connect with MongoDB multiple times. We connect once when the application starts. So I'm going to go to index.js. Here on the top, load Mongoose. So require Mongoose. And then connect to MongoDB. So mongoose.connect. Here we pass the connection string that is MongoDB : / localhost / and Vidly as the name of our database. So here we get a promise. If it's resolved, we display a simple message on the console. Connected to MongoDB. Otherwise, we catch an error. So console.log or console.error could not connect to MongoDB. Okay. Now back to our genres module. Genres. Okay, here on the top, we also load Mongoose. So constant Mongoose, we set this to require Mongoose. Okay, now we need to define a schema for our genres. So constant genre schema, we set this to new mongoose.schema. So what properties do we need here? All we need is the name property because the database is going to manage the ID property. So we set name to an object. This is a schema type object. We set the type to string. Let's make this required because we want to make sure that every genre has a name. And we can also apply a min and max length here. So min length, let's say 5 characters, and max length of 50 characters. Now that we have a schema, we need to create a model. So constant genre, we set this to a new mongoose.model. The collection we want to work with is called genre. Well, more accurately, it's genres, but here we use the singular name. And here we pass the schema, genre schema. Now in this code, this is the only place where we have referenced genre schema. So technically, we don't really need a separate constant to store this schema. We can take this expression and directly put it right here. And this makes our code a little bit cleaner. So that's what we have. Now that we have a model, we can get rid of this array. So delete. So here's our first route. In this route handler, we should return all the genres in our database. So we can set genres to genre.find. We want to get all the genres. Here we get a promise, so we await it. And we should also mark this function as async. Now in this implementation, we could also get rid of this constant and add this expression directly here. But I personally prefer to have this separate constant. I think in this particular case, this makes our code a bit more readable and understandable. But if you prefer to use this expression directly without defining a constant, that's perfectly fine. And one last thing. Here, I would prefer to sort the genres by their name. So sort by their name. So this is our first route handler. Now let's work on the second one. That is our post route handler. Now here we're creating a genre object, but we need to change this and use our new model. So we set this genre to a new genre model and then pass this object to initialize this genre. Now in this object, we don't need to set the ID anymore because this is set by the database automatically. So let's delete this. We can also put name on this line because we're setting only one property. So this makes our code cleaner. So here we have a genre object. Now we need to save it to the database. So instead of pushing this in the array, we're going to call genre.save. This returns a promise. We await it. And now we get the result, which is the actual genre document that is saved in the database. And this document contains the ID property. So we want to return this to the client. So here I'm going to change this declaration. Instead of a constant, I'm going to use a variable so we can reset genre. And then we'll return genre to the client. Okay, we're done with this route handler. Now let's move on to the next one. So the put method. Here first we need to find this genre. If we don't have it, we need to return a 404 error. Then we need to validate the object that we received from the client. And if it's a valid object, then we'll update the genre. Now here we can use the query first or the update first approach. In this lecture, I'm going to use the update first approach because I find it more efficient. So we're going to call genre.findById and update. Now as the first argument, we pass the ID, that is request.params.id. So let's add this here. The second argument is our update object. So here we set name to this expression, request.body.name. So let's add this here. And finally here we need to pass another argument. This is our options object. So here we set new to true to get the updated object from the database. Now here we need to await this promise, get the result, and store it here. Now because we have used await here, we need to mark this function as async. And actually I realized I forgot to do this in our previous route handler. So let's go back here. Here we should also apply async. Okay, so back to our put method. Now if we don't have a genre, we need to return this error. So we no longer need this line because we're not going to look up this genre in an array. Okay, so if we don't have a genre, we'll return a 404 error. Now with this new implementation, we need to move these two lines on the top. We need to validate this genre that we're getting in the request before attempting to update the database. So let's move this on the top. Now, we don't need to set this property anymore. This genre that we have here, this genre that we get here, is the updated genre. So if it's null, we're going to return a 404 error. Otherwise, we'll return this genre to the client. We're done with this route handler, so let's move on to the next one. Delete. Again, here I'm going to use a similar approach. So genre.findById and remove. We pass the ID, that is request.params.id. We get a promise, we await it, and store the result here. Now we have used await here, so we need to mark this as async. So we don't need to look up a genre in an array anymore. Now after this expression, if we don't have a genre, we're going to return the 404 error to the client. We don't need these two lines anymore because these are for working with an array. And finally, if we delete the genre successfully, we're going to return the same genre to the client. Simple as that. And the last route handler. So here we want to get a single genre. So let's call genre.findById. We pass the ID, that is request.params.id. Await this promise and get this genre object. And of course, we should make this function async. Now, We don't need this line anymore. This is for looking up a genre in our genres array. So if we don't have a genre, we're going to return a 404 error. Otherwise, we're going to return that object to the client. And now let's run this application and make sure everything is working. So node mon. Now here, because our entry file is index.js, we can exclude this argument. Just run node mon. Oops, I realized here I made a mistake. Here we have this error, cannot read property genre of undefined. So I figured out I made a mistake on line 5. Here, when defining a model, we're just going to call mongoose.model. This is not a class that we're going to new up. This is a method. So that was a mistake on my part. Now, back in the terminal, we can see we're listening on port 3000 and connected to MongoDB. Beautiful. So let's go back to our postman. Here I'm going to send a GET request to our genres endpoint. Send. So currently, because we don't have any genres in the database, we get an empty array. So on this tab, let's create a new genre. So I'm going to send a post request to the genres endpoint. Here I'm going to set the name to thriller. Send. Okay, this is hanging in here. So let's take a look at the terminal. All right, here we have this error. Joy is not defined. So it looks like I made a mistake earlier when we restructured this project. So back in index.js, I forgot to move this line from index to genres module. So let's cut this here. Back in genres.js, on the top, let's load joy. Because here we need to use joy to validate the genres that the client sends us. All right, now back in Postman, let's send another request. Okay, we got a 200 response. Beautiful. Here's our genre in the database. You can see here we have an ID that is generated by MongoDB. We also have this underline V, which is for version that is coming from Mongo. Now, if you don't want to return this to the client, you can simply exclude it from the genre object. For now, I'm not worried about that. Now, let's go back to our genres tab and get all the genres in the database. So you can see in this array, we have one genre object. Beautiful. Now let's update this genre. So I'm going to copy this ID on the third tab. Here we have a put request to this genres endpoint. Let me update this ID. And here's my request body. So I'm going to change the name to 1234. Send. Okay, you can see the genre is updated properly. However, if I change this name to something invalid, let's say an empty string, send, our validation should kick in. So here we have a 400 or bad request. Name is not allowed to be empty. And this is coming from Joy. Beautiful. And if we send an invalid ID here, so I'm going to replace 1 with 2 and change this name back to, let's say, horror. Send. So look, we get a 404 error not found. The genre with the given ID was not found. Beautiful. And finally, let's test the delete endpoint. So a new tab, I'm going to send a delete request to localhost/genres. And here's the ID of the genre we want to delete. So send. Okay, this genre is deleted and we got the same genre in the response. Now, if we go back to the second tab and get all the genres, here we should get an empty array. So let's see, that's it, beautiful. So all our endpoints are working perfectly.